Hello everybody, welcome to this advanced IT course of auditing in a ERP environment. In today's chapter, we will learn about general information technology controls. My name is Mahesh and I will be your instructor for this session. So let us start understanding what is general IT controls or general information technology controls. At a very high level, GITCs are the policies and procedures related to IT and systems within a company. Like every company has implemented ERPs and systems, and to manage and maintain the systems, certain policies and procedures with respect to the ERP and IT system will be required to be implemented by the company. These policies and procedures are very similar to any other policy procedures which the company has implemented. For example, the HR policy or a purchase policy or any other policy which is required by the company. These policies and procedures are required for the maintenance of integrity and security of data within the ERP system and any other IT system that the company may be using. The general IT controls are also known to be indirect controls or pervasive controls. Indirect because these do not directly impact the business process or the financial statement assertions. Pervasive because these controls are applied across the systems of the company, not specific to any particular system or application. And that is why general IT controls are known as pervasive controls and indirect controls. Now let us recap what are the different types of controls a company could have. There could be automated controls, there could be IT dependent controls, and there could be manual controls. General information technology controls, that is GITCs, are relevant to automated controls and IT dependent controls. GITCs are not generally relevant to the manual controls of a company. Let us understand why. Automated controls means the controls which are embedded into the IT applications or the ERP systems of the company. These could include edit checks, reasonableness checks, date range checks, sequence number checks, mandatory fields, user access controls, and password controls. IT dependent controls are basically manual controls, but which are dependent on certain data or input that is received from the system or an ERP. It could be a report or any other information or data produced by a system which is used in the performing of a manual control. These are termed as IT dependent controls. Manual controls are those controls which do not require the use of IT systems. The business operations or the business transactions are performed manually purely by the employees or individuals in the company without the need to rely on IT systems or data coming from IT systems. Examples of manual controls could include approval of vouchers, approval of purchase orders, performing reconciliations like BRS, authorizing payments, approving credit limits, or even segregation of duties is a type of manual control within a company. So having understood the different types of controls, let us now move on to see why GITCs may be required. There are certain risks within IT systems and ERP systems. Let us look at a few. One is the inaccurate processing of data. That is, data which is going through the systems or ERPs may not be processed accurately or even completely. So this is one risk which is related to IT or specific to the use of IT systems. The other risk could be unauthorized access to data. So people who are not supposed to be having access to data within a system may be provided access or may get access to modify, create, or change the data. This is one form of risk. Direct data changes. As we know, in an ERP system or any other IT system, the data is stored inside databases or data stores. Now, if any person gets access to make changes to those data, then it would defeat the purpose of having controls at the application level. Direct data changes would potentially bypass all the controls built into the application or any business process and give the ability to make changes to data in such a way that controls are not effective. Unauthorized changes to systems or programs. If people have access to make unauthorized changes to the systems or programs, then it could result in wrong processing or incomplete processing of data. And hence, this is one risk which is specific to IT that has to be considered by the auditors. Similarly, there are several other risks which are specific to IT that we need to consider as auditors, and even management needs to consider for the effective running of the IT systems within the company. So, what should be done to protect data or systems from these risks? Certain controls need to be implemented. What are those controls? These controls are typically the General Information Technology Controls, or GITCs as we call them. They are also known as ITGCs or General Computer Controls. The GITCs are categorized into several domains or categories as we call them, or grouping of controls. One is program changes. These basically cover controls over how programs are changed within a IT system. Data center and network operations. How issues and problems are identified, resolved, and tracked is something which is covered as a part of network operations. This relates to the availability of the systems for use by business. Access security is another category or domain of general IT controls. Within this domain, we look at the various layers of access or security which is provided throughout the IT systems or the IT landscape. The other domain is the system acquisition or system development. This is when new systems are purchased by the company or implemented throughout the company. And above all the categories or all the IT general controls are governed by the entity level controls. IT governance is the overall governance framework for managing the IT processes, policies, procedures throughout the IT systems of the company. IT governance forms part of the entity level controls of an organization and relates to the control environment and information systems and communications of the internal control framework. So we will look at each of these domains or categories in detail. So how do we scope general information technology controls? Let us see using an example. In an audit of financial statements, the auditor is required to understand the business, its environment, including the IT, as required by SA 315. And we need to document how the IT is organized, what are the various systems that are being used, the risks, and also the controls. So it is possible that in a company there will be multiple systems which are being used. Let us see the example. So in this example, we see that the company has implemented 4 different applications: SAP, Master, Ascent, and Budget Key. So these are the 4 systems which have been implemented within this company. Next, we can see the version of each system. The version of SAP that has been implemented is ECC 6 and the service pack is EHP 5. Why is this important? Knowing the version is important because in each version the risks could vary and the controls and the features could be different. So that is why we need to understand the version of each application so that we are aware of the specific risks or controls which are present in that particular version. So we map the version of each application. We also understand the purpose for which the IT system or ERP is being used. Here we see that SAP is used for the purpose of accounting, supply chain, and production. Paymaster is used for processing payroll. Ascent is an application that the company is using for their internal employee appraisal process. Lastly, Budget King is being used for internal MIS and budgeting purposes. So this is the purpose of the 4 application. The other aspect we need to understand is where are these systems located? Are these located in one geography or spread across multiple geographies? Here in this case, we can see that each application is residing in a different location geographically. SAP is even located outside of India. Next, we should understand the architecture, whether it is a client server or what is the infrastructure based on which the application is running. Here if we see, the architecture is a client server architecture, and SAP is running on a Unix operating system which is on 5.3 version, and the database used is MS SQL Server 2008. Like I said, it is important to understand the specific version of the database and OS, just like we need to understand the version of the application itself. Reason being, to repeat, each version will have its own set of risks, its own set of controls and features. And when we are auditing a specific version of a database or an operating system or any other system, we need to be aware about the risks or the controls within those specific versions. In this case, we see SAP is a client-server architecture and Paymaster is a web-based application. So since it is a web-based application, there is a web server also apart from an operating system and a database. There is also a web server which is involved in this application. Coming to Ascent, we see it is a Lotus Notes based system which is running on Windows platform. So Lotus Notes is a workflow system or an office automation system that is used across the world. Next we see the Budget King is also a web-based application system similar to Paymaster. Another key aspect we need to look at when understanding the IT environment is the various interfaces between each of those systems. Or each of this system could be either running on their own, or it is possible that some kind of data exchange may be happening. In this case, the data from Paymaster is being used by SAP. So there is a certain interface which is moving from Paymaster to SAP. We need to identify this. Similarly, Paymaster has an interface with Accent. So you can see that Accent as the appraisal system where the ratings and the appraisals of employees are decided is feeding data to Paymaster. Where the payroll is processed, the bonuses are calculated, the incentives are defined, and all these need to be accounted, which is in the SAP system. So this is how the interfaces are potentially working in this example. And if you see in the last, Budget King does not have any specific interface with other system. The other aspect we need to consider is whether the system is in-house or purchased. So in-house, we can see these two systems, Accent and Budget King, have been developed within the company in-house. It is possible that the company may have their own IT team who are capable of developing and maintaining ERP system within the organization. We can see that Paymaster and SAP are packaged systems. That is, they have been purchased from an external vendor. The next aspect we need to look at is whether there are any outsourced activities. So if there are certain activities which are outside of the company and which impact the internal processing or the internal controls and the ERP systems of the company, we need to understand as a part of our knowing of IT environment. So in this case, we have identified that payroll is being processed at an external party, which is ADP in this case. ADP is a company which processes payroll for several other companies. And in this example, we see that payroll is being processed by ADP. Next, we need to understand who are the key people in the organization with respect to IT and systems. Typically, it is the CIO or administrators. Now, administrators could be various types of administrators. There could be ERP admins, there could be system admins, database administrators, and web administrators. So we need to understand how the company or the IT organization is defined and who are the key people within the IT organization. Now, based on all these factors that we have seen so far, we need to conclude and we need to scope in which system is relevant for our audit. It is not necessary that we should audit all the systems that are within the company, or a company has implemented 4 systems. It is not required for us to audit or consider all the systems for our audit. We need to make that decision as auditors based on the purpose and other factors that are involved here. So based on all the information provided here, we have scoped in that SAP is an in-scope application for our audit of financial statement. Reason being, it is straightforward. It is using SAP accounting and supply chain and production, which are key processes from an audit point of view. Similarly, payroll is also one area where a lot of financial data is involved and financial accounting entries will be processed. However, if you see accent and budget key, they have not been scoped into the audit. The reason being, these are more operational in nature and it is not required for us to be looking into this for the financial statement audit. Now you can see how we have carried out an understanding of the overall IT environment and documented the same in a format which is easy to understand and demonstrate our understanding in a dashboard. We should also document in more detail the reason for our consideration or not considering a particular system into the scope of our audit. Now let us look at IT governance and what it involves. Basically, IT governance is a part of a larger corporate governance framework of any company and involves the establishment of IT framework in a company which defines the IT objectives, aligns IT with business. So defining of IT objectives would involve basically what is the purpose of setting up IT and the use of IT systems, what are the terms of reference, and what are the broad objectives for which IT has been implemented. Usually, IT used to be earlier a support function for all the business. In today's world, IT is most of the times a driver rather than being a support role. Aligning of IT with business objectives is also an essential part of the overall IT governance, because it may happen that IT has its own objectives and business may not be benefiting from the IT within an organization. So the alignment of IT with business is a very essential objective of IT governance. The IT organization. How is the IT organized? What is the organization chart? Who are the people involved? How does the reporting work within the IT organization? This is similar to any other department or function within a company. and it has to be owned up and rolled up to the top management. We also understand whether the company has adequate staff and people who are competent are hired and provided training as and when technology changes. What are the roles and responsibilities defined for the staff within IT? What is IT responsible for, and what are the roles and responsibilities for each and every person who is looking after IT? What are the broad policies and procedures which are defined for running the IT through the company? And how is the monitoring of IT service or IT quality and effectiveness monitored by the company from time to time? As we have said, IT governance is part of the larger governance framework of any company. As auditors, when we are looking at the audit of any company, we should look at the entity level controls and the governance framework of the company. Now, there is an internal control framework which is control environment, risk assessment, information and communication, and monitoring. So this is the internal controls framework of a company. Within this internal control framework, there is also one these four elements are called the software components or internal control components other than control activities. And information and communication is the one where IT governance will be relevant. The information and communication component requires auditor to understand how businesses operate, what are the relevant systems being used in processing of business transactions, what are the risks and controls pertaining to the use of information systems and the underlying infrastructure, and what is the reliability of information generated from these information systems. So all these aspects needs to be understood by the auditor as a part of understanding the information and communication component of the internal control framework. But what we should remember is, while information and communication is more relevant to the use of IT and systems within a company, by and large, in large and complex ERP systems, it is likely that other internal control components such as control environment and risk assessment and monitoring could also be very much relevant to the IT. Now let us look at a sample of how to audit or how to evaluate the IT governance. Let us say it is a checklist, and this is one example that we will go through. So these are some of the questions or a checklist that we can use to perform evaluation of the IT governance within a company which is typically using ERP systems. So we should start by understanding how is the IT department organized, who are the key people, and who is having the leadership position for the IT function. Typically, it is the CIO or a CTO who will be responsible for the functioning of IT within a company. What is the manner in which IT functions? Reports to the people who are charged with governance. That is, typically if there is a board of directors or audit committee, the reporting function of IT should be to the board or audit committee. Now, how is the reporting happen? Does IT work in isolation? Is something we need to understand and evaluate. Are there formal policies and procedures which are defined for the company? We have to look at the IT security policy or the information system policy that has been framed by the company for managing and governing the IT systems. What are the roles and responsibilities which are defined for the IT people? We need to understand. Is there adequate segregation of duties within the IT function? We have to make sure that just like any other business process where segregation of duties is an essential internal control, we have to also make sure that adequate controls have been put in place for the IT department also. Does the HR policies provide for the right kind of people to be hired? Are people with the required qualification and experience considered for the key positions of administrator or CIO or a CTO? This is very critical because the entire data is managed through the systems, and the people who are within the IT potentially may have access to all those data. And it is very essential that a background check or some kind of a procedure is performed to make sure people who are the right kind of people only are hired. Does the company have a process for this, and how is it followed? Is something we need to understand during our evaluation of the IT governance. Another key aspect is to understand whether adequate training is provided. As we know, technology keeps changing from time to time, and the people have to be kept up to date. New versions of the systems coming, new features coming. So how are people within the IT organization able to keep up with the changes? So periodic training has to be provided, and even the users of IT who routinely process business transactions need to be provided adequate training to process those transactions within the ERP systems. So apart from IT personnel, even the normal business user should be provided training from time to time. When new employees also join the company, they should be provided training on the IT systems and awareness on the IT systems as a part of their induction. Since ERP systems are integrated across business process, it is very much essential that the IT is having good communication and collaboration with other business functions. So how does the collaboration take place within a company is something we need to understand and evaluate. What is the process for identifying and addressing IT risks? Like we as auditors are required to identify and address IT specific risk which is required as a part of our audit. The company also needs to perform a similar kind of risk assessment within the IT. What framework or process has management adopted to perform this risk assessment? What are the results? How are they communicated? And what action is taken, whether controls have been put into place to address those risks? To what extent risks have been accepted? Is there any residual risk? So these are some of the things we need to consider at the time of evaluating risk assessment performed by the company. How does the company ensure reliability and effectiveness of IT systems? So many systems and so many ERPs which are being used. Now, how does management ensure that these are up and running and these are available and these are reliable? Is compliance and adherence to IT policies and procedures monitored and measured? So, like we have seen, it is possible that procedures and policies have been defined, but whether they are being adhered to is something that needs to be checked. So here we can look at how management does this compliance check. Is the internal audit involved in measuring or auditing the internal policies and procedures? What kind of procedures have been performed by the internal auditors? Are there any issues or deficiencies that have been observed? What remedial action has been taken to address these issues? And we should go through the internal audit report if it is available. and see how the quality and effectiveness of compliance with these policies are being measured. So in this way, as auditors, we can understand the IT governance and we can evaluate the procedures or the policies implemented by management for the purpose of governing IT. We need to also document the results of our evaluation as a part of audit documentation required by SA 230. Now let us see each individual domain of GITCs. We will start by looking at the activities within program changes. Program changes is basically the changes that are made to an ERP system. So from time to time, it is required that certain changes have to be put into the system because there is an error in the program. There could be a new requirement which has come up, a new report has been developed. So whenever systems are modified or ERP is modified, it should be made sure that the systems continue to meet the internal control requirements and are reliable for the purpose of financial reporting objectives. We will understand the program change activities through an illustration. The change management process would work something like this. Initially, there is a need for a change. A change request is initiated by one of the users of the ERP. The change request can also be initiated by the IT team if they have encountered or identified any kind of a bug, or when there is a new patch which has been released by the vendor. A change request is the first step in the change management process. The various types of changes could be a normal change which is initiated by a user. It could be a bug fix. What is a bug fix? A bug is an error in programming which affects the business transactions or reports within the ERP. So for this purpose, a change has to be made to fix the bug. Bugs may also be reported by users who are using the system as a part of the problem management and IT help desk activities. Whenever these are reported by users, the IT evaluates the problem or the bug and provides the required solution. Another type of change could be enhancement. So while there is no error or a bug, there could be new requirements which have come up as a part of regulatory changes or as a part of process changes within the company. When new functionality is added to the ERP, this type of change is called the change request or enhancement. Another type of request could be a minor change request where only a color or some kind of a superficial change is required, which is categorized as a minor change. Then there is a major change, which could be either an enhancement or a new module being implemented. Typically, the difference between a major change and minor change is the amount of effort which is required to perform the change or carry out the change. Another important type of change is an emergency change. Now, emergency change is when there is a problem in the system and it has to be corrected, but there is no time for applying the change management process. So in this case, the normal change management process is bypassed and the change is applied without following the process. However, it doesn't mean that the process should not be followed. It is only the timing of which the process is followed. Whereas in a normal change, the process is followed. In the case of emergency change, the process is followed after the change is made. The necessary documentation and approvals need to be obtained subsequent to the change. The reason for emergency also needs to be recorded and documented. As auditors, we need to be very careful about the emergency changes because emergency changes bypass the normal process. Another important type of change is the changes to infrastructure. Now, IT infrastructure, which is basically the operating system, the database, or the network on which the ERP is running, can also undergo changes. a new upgrade may happen, a new version can be implemented, patches, security patches can be provided by the vendors. For example, Microsoft provides security patches once in a month or as and when there is a new type of risk which is identified. These patches need to be implemented and applied into the ERPs. So like we can see, there are so many types of changes that can be initiated. This could be either by the end users or the business users, or the changes could also be initiated by the IT team itself. Let us move on to see what is the next phase of the process. After a change request is initiated, there is an activity of development. The change is taken by the developer and the developer starts making the coding or programming change for implementing the same. The next phase in the process is the testing. So once the program is developed, then the testing is performed whether the program is working as it is intended. Here, various types of testing can be done. It can be user testing, it could be unit testing, or user acceptance testing. And once the change is tested, it is implemented into the ERP. This is also called the go live phase. Now let us look at the individual activities which within each process. So whenever a new change is required, a change request is initiated. The change will be approved by a person who is a reporting manager or a business manager for that department. For example, if the stores department is requesting for a change in the ERP, the stores manager typically or the head of department typically approves the change. All changes need to be tracked and monitored because every day new changes are initiated. All the changes need to be monitored and tracked to completion. When the change goes to the development, that is after the change is initiated and the approval is provided, the change is going into development mode. During the development, the analysis and design is made. Analysis and design is more detailed when the change is large change. For small minor changes and bug fixes, it is likely that analysis and design may not be required. It depends on the nature and type of change. The coding has to be done as a part of development. Basically, it is the source code which is picked up by the programmer and that is modified as it is required by the change request form. Here we need to be careful whether modifying the code, whether the version of the code is controlled, because if there is a wrong version which is used, it could impact the other features of the ERP. Once the development is done, the programmer moves the change into the test environment for further testing. Unit testing is done by the developer so that the program which is developed or the change which is developed is tested independently to meet the objectives of which it was initiated. Integration testing can be done sometimes when the change impacts multiple areas of business. And finally, a user acceptance testing is done by the end user. Typically, it is a user who has initiated the change and requested for the change in the first place. The user finally gives approval, confirming that the change is as per the initial request, and then the change will be reviewed and monitored for quality purpose. So there is either a quality department or there could be an internal audit department which will review whether all the process and procedures which are required as per the change management process have been followed, whether the programmer has followed the correct coding standards while performing the change. These are all reviewed by the quality assurance team. The next stage would be to approve the implementation of change. Once all the review and quality assurance is performed, typically the IT manager or the head of IT or a manager in charge of implementation of changes will provide an approval for the change to be implemented in production system. For this, it is required that people who have access to production only will be able to implement the same. And finally, after all the approvals are provided, the change is moved to the production environment from the test environment. During this process, it is very critical and essential to ensure that there is adequate segregation of duties for the people who are involved in the change management process. Typically, the person who is initiating or requesting the change should not be also a developer. And typically, the person who is testing should not be performing the migration to the production. So similarly, there could be various scenarios in which segregation of duties will be required to be implemented. Typically, the maker checker, the approver of the change, should be ideally different from the initiator of the change, and likewise. So there could be so many types of segregation of duties that need to be looked into and implemented as a part of the change management process. Last but not the least, the entire process needs to be documented by the company, like who has initiated the change till the time of implementation. The entire chain of events need to be documented and stored for future reference and audit purposes. Now let us look at segregation of environments and also the segregation of duties that should be within a program change process. Typically, when the programs are developed, they are developed in the development environment. So the company should have a separate environment where changes are developed. This environment should be different from the environment of production where the business transactions are processed. In a development environment, typically only the developers or the programmers will have access to the development environment. They will have access to read, write and execute the programs. Developers can make modifications and changes to the existing programs. End users normally should not have access to development environment, and in this environment, the developers also carry out their testing. Once the unit testing is completed by the programmers and the change moves into test environment. So this is the other environment which should be separate from the development environment. The test environment will provide only read and execute access to the developers. The reason being, developers should not make unauthorized changes to the programs which have already been released for change. No modifications should be made to the source code, and end users should have access to perform testing in this environment. All types of testing, including integration testing and user acceptance testing, are carried out in the test environment. Once testing is completed, the change is implemented into the production environment, where developers should not have any access at all. If at all required, the developers may be granted read-only access. No modifications to the code also can be made in the production environment. End users or business users will have access to the production environment to carry out transactions and business activities through the ERP. Again, in this production environment, the source code is not available to be made or changed. So as we can see, there are three different environments in which the program change process should be working. And this is an example of how segregation needs to be maintained between the various environments. Now let us see an example of how this is implemented in a real life situation. Here we can see an example of one of the popular ERPs where the client has not allowed any changes in the production environment. As you can see, this is a production environment and no changes are allowed to the system in the production environment. And here we can see the layout of the system of the various environments. In this scenario, there is a development environment which is denoted by SBD, and any development which is done is carried through a transport layer to a SBQ, which is a quality system. So this is a development system and this is a quality, or also called the test environment. And once testing is performed, this is the production. SBP stands for the production system. Now this specific nomenclature can vary from company to company, and it is for us to understand how the system landscape has been designed by the company and implemented through the ERP. From here we can see in this specific example that the changes need to be initiated in the development and only carried forward to the quality, from which they will be implemented into production. It is not possible to make direct changes into production because for the production the setting has been set to no changes allowed. So as auditors, this kind of review or looking at this kind of configuration and setting through the system will give us the assurance that unauthorized changes may not happen in this production environment, and that is how we can get the assurance. Now let us look at an example of how documentation can be maintained for the program change process. This is again a real life example of how a company or a client would maintain the process of change management. So here we can see it is ABC company. There is a change request form in the ERP. Now this is a template which is used by one company, but a similar template can be used, or a different type of template can be used by other companies. The critical thing that we need to understand from here is that the documentation has to be maintained by the company. So when we go in as auditors, we can look at this documentation and understand what kind of changes have been made and how the approvals have been obtained. So here we can see the documentation has project name, the specific project ID, and these all could be optional and vary from company to company. The key thing here is who is the requester. So who has actually requested for the change? What is the designation of the person, and contact number and email ID for operational reasons. Another important thing in this form to note is the change request number. We have to make sure that all the changes are numbered in a sequence, so that when we come into audit, we know that all the changes are captured in the system. We can also look at the change date. So this is another critical column when the change request was initiated. This is also required when we come into audit because it will provide all the changes for the duration of our audit period. For example, if our audit period is say from 1st April to 31st March, we should take this date and all the changes which have been made during this date need to be considered as our population. Here we can see the other parameters, like which is the application in which the change is being made. So based on the application, we can either scope in or scope out our testing, because if the application is in-scope application, only then this form is relevant for us. We also look at what kind of functionality or module has been changed and what are the specifics of the change which have been made. And this is another important field, the status. So status can either be generally at the time of initiation, it is in an open state. Later, it can move into some kind of a development state. Then it can go into closed state. There could be several other status in between, and that could vary from company to company. But the thing to remember is this closed status. Why? Because as auditors, we are only interested in those changes which have been closed, which means they are implemented. Other changes which are work in progress, we may not be very much keen to look at because they don't impact the production system, and as auditors we may not have to look into those specific change requests. They don't pose a risk. If you see in the bottom, you can see there are several sign-offs which are provided. Who has requested, when, who is the HOD who has approved. This is typically a manager of the requester. Who has developed the change and who implemented the change, and whether the IT head is aware of the change being implemented. Typically, it is the IT who provides the final implementation go ahead. Here we can see who has done the UAT. So this is one example, and it is likely that in the company that you are auditing, there could be slightly different type of templates or different type of documentation which is maintained. However, the form is not important, but the content of the documentation and the fact that the documentation is maintained by the company is extremely critical for us, because when we go into audit the ERP for the changes that have been made during the year, we need to look at this documentation to get an assurance that changes have been carried out through the due process and no unauthorized changes have been made. In this example, it is a manual form that we have seen. However, several companies implement a ticketing system. A ticketing system is a workflow type of a system which captures all the details which are provided in this form as an electronic document. And the approvals are also provided electronically. Examples could include a remedy, or in the case of SAP, the more popular solution is the SAP Solution Manager, through which all the changes in SAP are managed. So similarly, every company or every ERP will have its own type of a change management system, and the way it is documented needs to be understood by us, and accordingly we can prepare our procedures to carry out the audit. Now let us look at some risks and controls within a program changes. Here we see that there are several risks which are possible in the process of program changes. So when changes are applied to IT systems and ERPs, what are the possible risks that can take place? So here we are seeing for each activity, here in this case change request, unauthorized changes are processed. So that is a risk. That means what? Anyone who is not having the authority will be able to process a change request. Now what is the control for that kind of a risk? The control that the company has implemented is that every change request is approved by the department or the HOD of the department. Like we have seen in the previous example also, that there is a manager who is approving or a HOD who is approving every change request. This person is a business person who is authorized to provide the approval. Changes to IT infrastructure. IT infrastructure is the operating system, the database, and the network on which the ERP application is running. even these infrastructure components undergo changes, and changes to these infrastructure components are provided by the IT head, because IT head is the head of department for IT. This doesn't involve business users. Now let us see testing. During testing, what could go wrong? What is the risk? The risk is basically untested changes could be implemented which compromise the integrity of financial data. Now that is a big risk for financial auditors. So what is the control that is implemented? We can look for the control that unit testing is performed by developer, user acceptance testing is performed by the end user when prior to implementation in the production environment. If this control has been implemented by management, this would address risk of untested changes being implemented. Similarly, let us see how segregation of duties is put into place. What is the risk if there is no segregation of duties? Changes are made directly in production, which is a big risk, and that could result in loss of data and integrity of the programs. If the integrity and data loss happen, it is not possible for us to rely on those systems. So what is the control that prevents this kind of risk from happening? As we have seen in the earlier example, 3 separate environments are existing for development, quality, and production. Basically, there is segregation between the development, quality, and production environments. Separate teams are involved in the development and migration of changes to production. So, 2 different people or 2 different sets of people are involved in the development activity, and they are different from the people who are actually migrating the changes to production. This will prevent unauthorized changes from being implemented into production. Imagine if a developer had access to the production system. The developer can go ahead and make any change that the developer may want, because they know the programming, they know the logic of the ERP, how it works. So it is possible that they can make unauthorized changes or tamper with the source code in the production system. And that is why we should ensure that the production system is locked for making direct changes. We have seen that in the earlier example. The other control is development changes. Development of changes are done by consultants, and movement of changes to production is performed by system administrator only after approval. So basically what it means is the consultants are the people who actually make the development, and the system administrators are the people who implement the changes. So that consultants, after making the development of the change, hand over the program files and the source code and the data that is required. They pass it on to the system administrators, who will implement these changes in production only after approval is provided. At the time of implementation, what can go wrong? What is the risk? Changes are implemented by unauthorized persons. So people who are not authorized to implement the changes have been given, may be able to implement those changes. So how is this controlled? Access to migrate changes to production is restricted to system administrators only. So this is similar to the earlier control that we have seen. So you can see that the same control is mitigating 2 risks here. Coming to documentation, what is the risk if there is no documentation? Changes may be applied or bypassed. Changes may be applied and the change management process may be bypassed, like we have seen in the example of emergency changes, or in the case of emergency changes, how the normal change management process is bypassed. That should not happen. However, there should be a control. Here in this case, a monthly review of all changes to the application is performed by internal audit or quality assurance department. So here we can see that there is an independent function which is looking at all the changes that have been made in the ERP on a monthly basis. So even if the change management process has been bypassed for one particular change or a few changes, it can be picked up in a monthly review of all the changes, where an independent team is looking at the changes and making sure the documentation is available. Any exceptions that the internal audit team finds will be reported to the senior management and those charged with governance. This is typically similar to the type of work or the nature of work that we do as external auditors or statutory auditors. So here, this is one example of identifying risks for each activity within the change management process. And having identified the risks, we also need to determine what controls management has put into place. Once we have done our evaluation and assessment, we should go ahead and test all these controls. So it is not enough to understand what controls are in place. We also need to test these controls for operating effectiveness. So with this, we have completed our understanding of how change management process works in a company with respect to IT systems and ERPs. We have also looked at examples of how controls are implemented and configured within the system. We have seen how documentation needs to be maintained by the company, which as auditors we would audit later. We have also seen examples of the various risks and the controls that mitigate the risk, which can potentially be put in place by the company. Now we move on to the next domain of GITC, that is system acquisition or system development. So in system development, it is starting with the project planning. System acquisition or system development happens when a new system or new ERP is implemented within a company. Typically, it could involve implementation of an ERP, and it starts with the project planning. Once the project planning phase is complete, the systems analysis happens. During system analysis, the various requirements, the business requirements, the functional requirements are captured by system analysts and business consultants who understand the working of systems and the business, and these are converted into a document called the functional requirement specification document. This document is provided to the designers of the systems or the architects who create the system or who design the system as per the planning and the analysis document. During the system design phase, the data flows, the table structures, the relation between modules are designed. The analysis and design document is provided to the programming team or the developers who will actually start taking the coding or the changes. So this is typically called a system development life cycle, which is a model which is used in software development process. It is likely that not all companies go through this process these days, because when implementing an ERP, the process could slightly be made faster, because the element of design or the amount of coding is not required to the extent that the project is being done in-house. If the project is done in-house, the project may be longer duration, whereas if a package or a ready-made ERP is procured or acquired and implemented, the amount of time may be reduced in the coding. Once the coding or the customization is completed, the testing phase needs to begin. Here again, the testing involves all types of testing, including user acceptance testing, unit testing, integration testing, black box testing, white box testing, lots of testing. Documentation needs to be maintained for all the activities within the system development lifecycle. And also training needs to be provided to users within the company so they are in a position to understand and operate the system without making mistakes and errors. Finally, when everything is ready, the system is implemented. It is called the go live phase. The system acquisition, the new system development or system upgrades is being provided to you as a separate chapter as a part of this course. So here we will not go into more detail rather than understanding the various activities of the system acquisition and development category. One aspect we need to understand here is that the system development is very similar to the program changes. If you have seen, the kind of activities which happen in the system development phase are very similar to the activities which take place in the program change process. The similar activities exist in both the categories of domains of these two GITCs. So what is the difference? The difference is that program changes is a phase of the system development's life cycle, and this begins after the implementation of a new system. So just to reiterate, system development involves the implementation or development of new systems in a company. And after the go live date of the new system, whatever changes are made to the system are considered under the program change management process. So this is the key difference between the system development phase and the program change phase. However, in case after the implementation of a ERP, if there are large program changes which are required, for example, implementing a new module, or it could be implementing of a new or improved version of the ERP where the functionality has changed. In that case also, a program change which is very large can also be considered as a system development phase. So these are the key differences between the system development phase and program change phase. So let us now look at the other domain of ITGC or GITC, which is the access security. Access security is one of the categories or domain of general information technology controls that involves the understanding and evaluating the processes, the risks, and the controls that are relevant to user access security configurations in the IT environment and the ERP systems. The objective of this domain is to understand and ensure that access to programs and the data, not only the programs but also the data, that is authenticated and authorized to meet the financial reporting objectives. Access security is not a single control or a single point of control. Actually, access security cuts across various layers of the IT environment. Let us look at the various layers in detail. At the outermost layer, we have the physical and environmental aspects to consider. In the physical security and the environmental security, we look at how systems are protected from unauthorized access by people physically. The environmental controls involve the fire suppression mechanism, the smoke detectors, and other operational aspects which physically protect the environment in which the IT and ERP systems are operating. The next layer, which is the inner layer, contains the networks and the LAN, the WAN, and the VPNs which protect the systems from external access. Security needs to be considered even at the network layer because a lot of network equipment like the LAN, the routers, the switches, the hubs, and all these devices will have certain amount of user access and controls, configuration controls, which are embedded within these devices. And these devices protect the network or the data from external access and even within unauthorized access internally. Inside the network layer comes the application layer, In this example, the application we are talking about is the ERP called SAP R3. So the application layer resides inside the network layer, and all the business process controls, automated controls, and IT dependent controls will form part of the application layer. So this is the layer which, as auditors, we will be more interested in considering the controls. The next layer will be the operating system layer. Like we have also discussed in the previous slides, the application resides on an infrastructure which includes the operating system and also the database. So operating system layer is also one of the critical layers which supports the running of the application. Even in the operating system layer, we have several aspects of security that will be relevant to a financial reporting. We will look at all those in detail in the subsequent slides. The innermost or the most important layer in the security is the database layer. The database is where the entire financial data or any other data resides, and this has to be protected from unauthorized access and unauthorized changes. So as we can see, it is not enough to implement controls only at the application layer. We should expect to see controls at all the layers of security that support the IT environment. Now, having understood the various layers within the security framework, we will move on to see what are the various activities which are relevant to the access security. One of the most important activities within access security is the user management process. We will discuss more about user management process later in the session. Basically, user management involves the creation, revocation, modification of user access to systems. When we say systems, it includes the ERP, the application, the infrastructure as well. Another key activity within access security is the audit logging and monitoring. This is basically implementing of audit trails to ensure that any activity is tracked and monitored. One of the most common examples of activities within access security is the password configurations. As we know, to log into any application, it requires a user ID and password. Keeping the password safe and secure is one of the key controls within the security domain. We will understand more about password configuration, and we will also see examples how password controls should be implemented or are implemented within an ERP application. Direct data access. This is again a very critical aspect where data can be directly accessed by the administrators or any other unauthorized users, and how we need to protect those kind of access. File system security is another activity which is primarily to do with the operating system level controls. We will look at file system security in a little more detail and see an example of that. Domain security relates to the network level security or the operating system level security within the IT infrastructure. This comes before the access to ERP is obtained. And finally, like we have seen, the outermost layer contains the environmental controls and the physical security controls. So these are the more common activities within the access security domain. Now we will look at each of these activities in a little more detail along with examples. First up, we will look at user access management. User access management involves the granting of access to users. It could be new users or it could be existing users who are being provided new access. For example, when a new employee joins a company in the stores department, a new user ID is created and granted access to the network as well as to the ERP to process goods movements. In the case of an existing employee who is working in the accounts payable section and he is promoted as a manager and transferred from one factory to the head office, his or her ERP access should be modified by removing the access at the account payable level, and a new access should be provided at the head office level. So in this way, we can see how new users are created, user access is modified as and when there is a transfer or elevation in the role of an employee. The next activity within user access management is the revocation of user access. Revocation or termination of access will be required, typically when an employee resigns or retires from the organization. So at the time of leaving of the employee, the access should be removed from the application and also from any other system, including the operating system or the domain or the network where the employee may have been provided access. All the access has to be revoked in a timely manner. Another important activity within user access management is the periodic review of user access. Periodic review involves taking a list of all the user access and their roles within the application, the operating system, and the database. That is basically all the layers of the IT environment, and looking at whether the user access is commensurate with the job responsibilities of that user. So this kind of a review is done by an independent person. Typically, the access or the data is provided by the IT team to individual business head of departments who look at the access of the employees and confirm whether the access is right or any change is required to the access. In case there are certain accesses which are not required, the same have to be revoked or removed. So periodic review of user access is more of a detective control, which generally happens once in a month or once in a quarter, or in many organizations where the user base is very large, it could happen even more often. The next important function in user access management is managing the segregation of duties and sensitive access. Again, this involves granting and modifying users access to systems which is commensurate with their job responsibilities. We have a separate session on SA/SOD in this module, where we will be looking in detail how SA and SOD are implemented in a ERP system and how, as auditors, we should look at the auditing of sensitive access and segregation of duties. Privileged user access is also a very important concept within user access management. Privileged user access, commonly also known as super user access or administrative access. Privileged user is a user who is having full or unlimited access to IT systems and applications. The privileged users may exist at all layers of the IT environment, that is, at the application layer or the database layer or the operating system layer, and even at the network layer. Now let us understand about audit logs and how it is relevant to our GITCs. An audit log or an audit trail is a historical record of events and activities that take place in an IT environment. This could happen across the application and the infrastructure which is supporting the application. Audit logs are relevant to all layers of the IT environment. In most IT systems and applications, there are features that will ensure that audit logs can be enabled. It is an optional feature in many of the systems. So as auditors, we need to ensure that this optional feature has been switched on at the time of implementation of the ERP or the particular IT system. So that is the way in which audit logs need to be enabled. In the newer system, the audit logs come default as enabled. So we need to understand which system has a default audit log enabled and which system needs an optional enable of audit log. One important feature is that audit logs, since they record all the activities or several activities that happen in the systems, the size of the audit logs can grow tremendously. And that is why storage of these audit logs and retention is a key challenge. and we need to understand how the client is able to manage the storage and retention of audit logs. It is also necessary that these audit logs, when they are stored, needs to be secured so that tampering of the audit logs does not happen. Due to the size and the volume of data which is stored inside an audit log, there could be issues with reference to the performance of the system, and it is likely to impact the operation of the ERP or the system itself. So the suggested approach is to enable audit logs only for critical activities and functions. For example, enable audit logs for the activities performed by a super user. Do not enable audit logs for activities performed by all users. We don't need a history of all the transactions in the system at all the time. We only need an audit log for the critical functions or activities. Another example where an audit log needs to be enabled is for the changes to master data or the configuration controls within the ERP. As we can see, managing the audit log smartly will ensure that the size and the storage will not become a challenge. And this is something we need to look at as how the clients or the companies manage their audit log process. Many systems, including Unix, Windows, and Oracle database and MS SQL Server database, these days provide advanced features for smartly managing the audit logs. Specific events can be enabled and recorded. We will look at an example of what are those critical events and how it can be enabled with an example. The next important concept within audit logs is the review of audit logs. Now, it is not enough to just enable the audit log and store the audit log. Somebody has to look at the audit log and identify if there are any unauthorized or exceptional activities that happen during the running of the ERP. Basically, there should be a process within the company where somebody who looks at the audit logs, and that person should be an independent person and should not be responsible for administration or maintenance of the audit log. The independent person should take a look at the logs and note any unauthorized activities or exceptional events which have taken place during a period of time. Typically, review of audit logs is done as a monthly control or maybe as a quarterly control, as may be the case, and it is dependent on company to company and the policies the company has implemented. Let us look at an example of how our audit log can be enabled. So this is a screenshot of an audit log event within a Windows system. As you can see, there are several events which can be defined. So there is a feature to enable account logon events. So whenever somebody logs into the system, that event is logged. Similarly, there are other features where the client can, depending on the risk assessment, enable those events. Here we can see the audit of privileged use. This is basically the auditing feature for a privileged user or a super user. You can see there is a option to enable the audit for system events. System event is basically the errors or any failures that happen within a system during the operation. In this example, we can see that even though there are several policies for auditing, none have been enabled in this case. So as auditors, we need to look at the specific settings and compare this with the policy of the company. The company may have a policy for defining the auditing and logging of critical events. We need to look at the policy, and the reason why the policy has not been implemented needs to be looked at. Let us look at another example. While the earlier example, this is an audit log at a Windows system, which is the operating system on which the ERP is running. Here in this case, we look at an audit log at an application level. Now in this case, we can see that The name of the parameter is called REC stroke client or rec client. Now this parameter is set to off, which means it is not enabled. So the user has to define a certain value to be enabling this audit log. This setting basically enables or disables the logging of changes to specific tables within the ERP. And we should ensure that this parameter has been set to a specific value in the user defined value. Another parameter in the same ERP is the RSAU stroke enable. So this is a general audit logging feature of the ERP which records all the security events pertaining to the day-to-day working of the ERP. Some of the examples could include like who are the users who are logging in, which specific functions a user has processed, and there are several other events that can be logged. However, in this case again, as we have seen, the value has been set to 0, which means the logging is not enabled. This has to be a value of 1, and then the system will start recording the auditing events. So now let us look at the other aspect of security, which is the password security. As we are all familiar, any application that we use requires a user ID and password. However, it is possible that the password can be a weak password. And in case the weak password is used in the ERP or in any other layer of the application security or the infrastructure security, then it could lead to a compromise of the systems. As we have seen, all the layers are connected and interconnected. So any breach at any one layer could result in easy access to that particular layer and also provide access to the further inner layers of the overall security framework. So password is basically a secret code, you can say, that is used in combination with the user ID to gain access to an IT system or an application. Because of the sensitive nature of password, unauthorized users, including hackers, most often target the passwords. So any hacker would like to find out your password, and if the password is weak, it is easy to crack it. Many systems provide options for enabling the configuration and increase the security of password controls so as to prevent the compromise of the password getting cracked. We will look at an example of what are the various options which are available for securing the password within an ERP. The next important aspect of password security is the default passwords. So default passwords are basically those passwords which come packaged along with the application or the system which we have procured or the company has procured rather. All new systems, applications and network equipment which are supplied by vendors usually come with a set of user IDs and passwords. For example, if there is a Wi-Fi router you have purchased, the default ID in that Wi-Fi router would be an admin, and the password will also be an admin, or a password would be a password itself. So that ID is called a default ID. Similarly, in ERP applications also, when the ERP or the database or even the operating system is implemented, there are a set of users along with a set of well-known passwords that are supplied. The purpose of these default IDs is to facilitate easy implementation and installation of that equipment or the software. However, the risk is once the implementation is done, these passwords need to be changed. If these passwords are not changed, since the password is well known, it is very much likely that the password could be compromised easily by an unauthorized user or a hacker. We will look at an example of default passwords within a database. First, let us take a look at the example of password configuration within a ERP. So this is a live example from an ERP system. So here we can see the various parameters that are provided by the ERP vendor so that passwords can be configured to be secure. Here we can see The configuration provides the option to set up password digits. How many digits should be provided within a password? How many letters should be included? Minimum number. So it is basically the minimum password letters, means minimum number of letters or characters within a password that a user should define. What is the length? This is the most common parameter or the configuration for password. Here we can see the length has been set to 6 characters. That means a user can define a password which is not less than 6 characters in length. Then there are options for using lowercase and special cases. So these are configurations which are set up at a one time during the implementation of ERP, and once these configurations are in place, the users will be forced to follow this policy. Again, as auditors, we need to make sure that this is complying with the company policy. So company policy on passwords. In this example, we see that only one parameter has been enabled, that is the password length has been enabled, whereas all the other parameters are not enabled, which means that the password is not a complex password and easy passwords can be used by the users of the ERP. That would actually create a scenario where passwords can be guessed easily because they are very small in length. Ideally, the password length should be at least 8 characters, which is the best practice. And it should have a combination of either digits or lowercase or one special character. Now let us look at an example of default passwords which are in a system. So here we look at the example of an Oracle database. So this is an example of Oracle database where the data is stored. As we can see here, there are several user IDs which are shipped at the time of installing or implementing a database. As we know, ERP works and stores data within the database. And when you implement the database or when companies implement the database, there are several user IDs which are created. Some of them include Oracle or a DBA, DBSNMP, and the important ones are sys and system and sys. So these are the admin IDs which we need to be careful about. So we can see that for all these user IDs, the password is already defined within the system, which is the default password. This is what we call the default password. So for Oracle, the password is Oracle. For Aura DBA, the password is Aura DBA pass. And similarly, you can see the password against each of the user IDs. We need to be careful about this specific ID. So for system, the password itself is mentioned as change on install. However, if you go and see at many companies, this password will not be changed at all. So we need to be careful and sensitize the companies to make these changes. Otherwise, anyone in the market, this is freely available on internet. These passwords are freely available on internet, and in fact these passwords are also mentioned in the official documentation of Oracle. So it is very easy to know the passwords of these IDs, and some of these IDs being very critical in nature. These are the privileged IDs or the super user IDs. The password need to be changed immediately upon installation, which is also suggested by the Oracle documentation. Now you can see these are the password hashes. So the moment you get data from an Oracle database, you can compare the hash values. Even though password is not stored in this form, the password is stored as a hash value. And this hash value can be compared against the hash value of the particular company that you are auditing, and you can match that value to the corresponding English text password. So we can see how default passwords can be easily compromised and why it is important to lock those passwords or change the passwords uh, as soon as the implementation or installation is completed. In fact, it is a good idea to lock up all the IDs which are not useful for the operation of the ERP. Similar type of passwords and users will be available in the other databases like MS SQL Server or any other database. Also, the similar type of user IDs and default passwords will be available at every operating system level, like Unix operating system, Windows operating system, and even within the application like a SAP, Oracle, PeopleSoft, or any other ERP or any other application that you may be aware of. Another important aspect is similar type of user IDs and passwords may also be available or be present within the network equipment. So as auditors, we need to cover all the layers of security and ensure that default passwords do not exist at any of the layer. Because even if one layer is breached, then it provides access to the next layer. Now let us look at file system security. File system security is basically to do with the file system at the operating system level. File system is not very relevant to the application layer or even the database layer. It is more specific to the operating system layer. File system is basically the place where the files are organized and stored within the operating system. Ultimately, all the data, the programs, and everything else which is related to IT and the application reside on the operating system as files and folders. These could include critical files and critical folders. Now, what are critical files or folders? These could have application programs, data files which hold the data, backups, configuration, and user security files. User security files, for example, the SAM file in a Windows is a user security file where all the Windows user IDs and passwords are stored. So this is basically the physical storage of files and folders on the operating system. Access to the critical files and directories that contain sensitive information should be restricted to a limited number of users. Typically, these are the system administrators or the IT administrators. Now let us look at an example of how a folder or a file structure looks like in a Unix system. This is an output or a screenshot of a Unix directory or a file system. Here we see that all are files. Then the first character within each line is denoted by either a D or a hyphen. D stands for a directory or a folder, as we call in Windows. In Unix, it is called a directory. If there is a hyphen in the first column, it is an indicator that this is an example of a file. Then we can see who are the users who have access to the specific files or directories within this Unix file system. So here we can see on the left hand side, the user root is having the ownership of this specific directory, which is called tracker. And the user root also belongs to a group which is known as root. So here in this example, we have a group and we have in this example, all the users and the group is root itself. Now we see another example of what are the various permissions for each file or directory. So if you see, the first character indicates the directory or file. The next three characters indicate the permissions for the owner. So you can see that read is R, W stands for write, and X is for execute. So the user or the owner here has access to read and write. The next three characters mention the access permission of the group. Here the group has access to only read the specific file. In this example, we are talking about the file user-dirs.local. The third set of characters, or the last three characters, provide permissions for the world or everyone else other than the owner and the group. So here also we can see that only read permission has been provided to everybody other than the owner and the group, and for the same file. The next important aspect of access security relates to the network. Within the network security layer, we look at the domain security. Domain security relates to the domain, which is a repository of all the objects in the network domain. This includes user objects, or it could include groups or access rights and permissions which are implemented at the domain level. Typically, a domain could be implemented through a Windows or even a Unix operating system. A domain forms part of the company's internal network and is used for authentication and authorization of users before they get into the ERP and the applications. The users could also use the domain security or the domain to share files, folders, and drives throughout the company using the local area network. The internal network consists of the local area network, the network equipment, and any other hardware or software, including firewalls, which may be required for protecting the data flow through the internal network of the company. External networks could be your firewall or any other device which is operating at the perimeter of your internal network. Basically, this is like a gatekeeper network or a set of devices which protect the company's internal network from external threats. We will look at an example of how the internal network and the external network look like. The other key aspect of network security, which is very important for us to look at, is remote access. Now, remote access can be used by several of the administrators or even users to log in remotely to the ERP or the IT systems of a company. Typically, users log in remotely using either virtual private networks or VPNs as they are known to work remotely. We need to make sure that the remote access is adequately secured. Another aspect of network security is managing the protection from viruses and malwares. Today, we see a lot of virus hitting the systems and applications throughout the world. Malware is a new challenge, including ransomware, which are being continuously coming up in the public domain. As systems are more and more networked throughout the world, it is very likely that some kind of a virus and malware spread through the system, either through the use of emails or pen drives or any other data sharing mode. So the company has to ensure that all the attacks which come through the form of virus or malwares or ransomwares need to be protected. Now let us look at a simple example of how a network is designed or how a network is laid out in a company. So in this example, we see that these are the individual systems which users use, and this entire ecosystem is the company's internal network. These could be your servers, where ERP is running on the servers. There could be multiple servers or there could be a single server. This could be an example of a file server or even a domain that is available in the internal network. So typically, users make use of the internal network while accessing the systems. It is also possible that certain external users may be there who access the internal network, who may be required to access the internal network. Now these could be your suppliers or your partners or associates or even consultants or contractors who may be required to use the internal network. Here we can see the internal network is protected by certain gatekeepers or routers, and in between there is a web server to protect the internal network from the external network. Now this area is called the DMZ. DMZ stands for a demilitarized zone. So whenever an attack is coming from an outside network, so the attack is handled by the web server and the internal systems are protected from any such attacks. And that is why a DMZ isolates the internal network from the external network. And here we can see that there is a firewall. Now it depends on the company where the firewall is placed. Sometimes the firewall could be placed nearer to the internet, or there could be a firewall which can be placed in the internal network, or it is possible that there can be two sets of firewalls which are placed both at the perimeter of the internal network and also at the external gateway to provide additional security. And here we can see there are remote users who are trying to access the system of the company through a remote internet connection, possibly using a VPN. We need to make sure that a VPN is used when connecting remotely, because VPN provides a secure tunnel to access the internal network. So as auditors, we need to understand how the company has implemented the overall architecture of the network and where things could go wrong and to what extent it is relevant to an audit of financial statements. That is a key consideration. From a cyber security or a network security point of view, these are very critical controls, but from a financial statement audit point of view, sometimes these network security or network controls could be considered as more operational in nature. However, it also depends on the nature of the business. Example, if a company is typically a manufacturing company and using only a single ERP in one location, then looking at network security may not make sense. However, if it is a web-based business and web-based portal is used for making transactions where all the external vendors are connected, then it may make sense for us to look at network security in more detail, even though it relates to the operational aspects. Because in that case, it is possible that some of the business process and controls are built into the web server itself. The business rules and logic could also be hosted on the web server. And in that case, network security and all the configuration of firewall, VPN, DMZ, all those become relevant from an audit point of view. So we have to understand the network and the business and correlate what is more important for the audit. If financial transactions are being initiated from the internet, it may make sense for us to look at the network security controls in more detail. If not, then we may limit our audit work only to those controls which are more relevant to the internal network and limited only to the domain or even to the servers itself. So as we go to the outermost layer of the security, which is the physical security, we look at controls of how physical systems, physical servers, physical infrastructure is being protected from unauthorized access. We look at the security of computing facilities, whether the premises is locked, whether there is a security guard who is available, how are data centers protected from unauthorized access, are there cameras, are there CCTVs which record who is entering and who is using the facilities. Many times it is also possible that there could be biometric controls, and depending on the criticality of the infrastructure, the level of controls or the number of controls could be higher. Under physical security, there are several other controls which are environmental controls. because computing facilities are sensitive to the environmental hazards like fire, water, humidity, etc. It is very critical to protect the systems from damage because of these hazards. So physical security and environmental controls are part of the same physical security layer, and these relate to the computing facilities that process, store, and transmit sensitive and critical data. These security controls also protect the IT from operational failures, theft, and stealing of confidential data information. It could also protect the system from data loss due to corruption. So to summarize, the manner in which access security is implemented will vary on the nature, size, complexity, and the business operations, and to the extent in which systems are used within a company. While most of the activities which we mentioned are critical for the company, it is likely that some of these activities are not relevant from a financial audit point of view. For example, security activities that relate to the database layer that directly protect the integrity of financial data will be more relevant to our audit. Whereas security activities which pertain to the outer layers, including the network or even the physical security layer and the environmental controls, may not be that relevant from a financial audit point of view, even though for the company these layers may be very critical. So as auditors, we need to determine and apply our thought and judgment in determining which are the relevant activities which relate to our audit. Here we look at the mapping between the security activities that we have seen, the various security activities of user management, segregation of duties, sensitive access, privileged user access, audit logging and monitoring, password configuration, direct data access, file system security, domain security, firewalls, VPN, network and antivirus controls, and physical and environmental controls. We have seen several activities as a part of the access security that we need to look at as auditors. We have also mapped this to the respective layers of the security that we have discussed. So in this slide, you can see the relation between the activity versus the layer at which the activity operates. For example, you can see that user management is relevant to all the layers of security. Why so? Because users exist at the application layer, users exist at the database layer, the operating system, and also network and physical layer. So we need to consider user management at all layers of security. Similarly, sensitive access and segregation of duties need to be maintained at all the layers. For example, the database administrator should be separate from the administrator who is managing application security or the administrator who is managing operating system security. Physical user access also applies to all the layers because super users exist at all the layers. Audit logging and monitoring also applies to all the layers because at every layer it is critical to log the critical events and activities so that these can be reviewed at a later point of time. And it is possible to identify, in case an incident happens, it is possible to identify at what layer the breach has happened. Even password configuration will be relevant to all the layers of security. As we are aware, at each layer of the security, that is the application, passwords are relevant. Database, passwords are relevant. Operating system, passwords are relevant. Because wherever there is a user, a password will always be relevant. And hence, password configuration also applies to all layers of security. Now we see the example of direct data access. Now, direct data access typically relates to only the database security or the operating system security layer. Reason being, the direct data access will not be possible through the application. So it is not relevant from an application point of view to look at direct data access. Direct data access is also known as backend access. So it is a bypass to the application security. And also at a network and physical layer, the direct data access is not applicable or it may not be relevant. File system security is very specific to operating system security. Sometimes we may also look at file system security for the data files which reside at the operating system. So there could be a slight overlap between the database layer and also the operating system layer when we are looking at file system security. Domain security is again relevant at the operating system layer because domain is typically implemented either in a Windows or a Unix environment. And the security of this domain is to control the access at a network layer. And that is why we say the controls are implemented both at the operating system layer and the network security layer. Looking at firewalls, VPNs and antivirus, these again relate to the operating system level because the relevant controls need to be implemented. The antivirus has to be implemented at an operating system level. Typically, it is implemented in one system, which is a server, and then it is all the antivirus is updated through all the other systems within the company as a push mechanism. Firewalls and VPNs are relevant more at the network security layer, as these relate to remote access to the internal network from a remote site. And finally, environmental controls or environmental security is relevant only to the physical layer, where the physical protection of information systems or the information infrastructure, IT infrastructure, is relevant only at the physical security layer. So with this, I hope that we have understood the various layers of security and various activities within security and how these are related to each other. Now let us look at some examples of what risks can be present within the access security domain and what controls can be implemented by a company to protect those or mitigate those risks. Here we see an example of risks at various activity layers of the access security. As we have discussed, user management, password, access logging, and so on. These are the various activities which are present in the access security domain. Now let us look at the risk at each of those activities. What can be some risks? Unauthorized access to systems could be one risk which relates to user management. That means unauthorized users who do not require the access or who should not be having access to systems are able to access the systems. This is a risk. Now, what is a possible control that management can implement? In this case, we see that a formal approval process for creating, changing, and removing access to the application has been implemented as a control by the company. And when we go as auditors, we need to evaluate and whether this control has been implemented by looking at a sample. And once we evaluate, we also need to validate. We need to validate or test whether the control is working throughout the year. Next risk would be users have excessive access to system. That means users could have access which is over and above what is required to perform their job responsibilities. In this case, the control which is implemented is a periodic review to verify that user access is consistent or commensurate with the job responsibilities. Here, as we have discussed earlier also, typically a list of users and their access levels within the system is generated by the IT department, and this is provided to individual department or head of departments to make sure that the access is in line with the user job responsibilities. For example, a store manager would be provided with a list of all the users within the store's department, and each user wise access is provided to the manager. The manager has to look at that and confirm back to IT if any changes in that access level is required. Once a feedback is received from all the departments about the access level and the confirmation is obtained by IT, IT should implement all these changes, if any, into the systems. It is not enough to do a review. It is also important to take action on the result of the review. Now let us look at the activity of password. What is the risk with passwords? Weak passwords may compromise security controls. We can see that the control here is a robust password policy is implemented at the application layer, the database layer, and also the operating system layer. Now let us look at another example. Here in the activity, access logging and monitoring. So what could go wrong here? Unauthorized activities may go undetected, or as we have seen that any activity or unauthorized activity which is performed may go undetected. Like we have discussed earlier, the example of privileged users activity which needs to be logged and monitored. So what is the control? Special system utilities for accessing data are logged and reviewed on a regular basis. So here the critical thing is first is to log and then subsequently to review and on a periodic basis. Audit trail controls are designed and monitored by management for potential unauthorized activities. So these two controls go hand in hand to mitigate the risk that some unauthorized activities has happened and they have gone undetected. So having these two controls would help management get the assurance that unauthorized activities, even if they have happened, have been identified or detected in a timely manner. Coming to network security, the risk is computer virus may cause data loss or corruption. Now what is the control? Appropriate software, or rather antivirus software or anti-malware software should be installed, and the key thing is updated regularly. So many times we see that antivirus software is installed, but most of the softwares are outdated. As a result, they are not able to protect the systems from newer viruses or newer malwares. So it is very critical to protect the system from virus attacks. Another control that could be implemented is regular update of patches at the operating system level or the database level to prevent the risk of viruses attacking any system. At the network security layer, the risk is unauthorized persons and hackers may gain access to financial data. So only if this risk relates to financial data, we may want to consider this as a relevant thing for the audit. So in this case, the internal network is protected from unauthorized access via external connections by using or placement of firewalls and other network equipment. So this is the control that the company has implemented. We may want to see the network diagram of the company and make sure that the firewalls or the VPNs are placed at the right location so that they are in a position to prevent any unauthorized access or any hacking from a remote place. Physical security. What can go wrong here? Unauthorized users may gain access to computing facility. Is it possible that somebody can just walk into the data center and tamper with the equipment there? So certain controls need to be implemented for computing facilities, which include the data center, which also include the storage like backup tapes or disks, which can store the financial data. These need to be appropriately restricted. It is also likely that these storage devices or equipment should be protected from other environmental hazards like fire, smoke, etc., or even dust for that matter. So these are some of the examples of the controls which mitigate the risks for the access security. So there could be several other risks and other controls which mitigate those risks that we need to consider, and these need to be considered on a company to company basis, and also depends on the scope of our audit or the business process of the client also. There are many factors we need to consider, and only those controls or risks that are relevant to our financial audit need to be evaluated and also validated. Evaluation is basically whether the control is existing. We take a sample, and validation provides us the assurance that the specific control has been operating throughout the year. So now let us look at the domain or the category of general IT controls, which relates to the data center and network operations. We also call it the IT operations for short. So this is the category of general IT controls where we need to obtain an understanding of the process, the risks and controls that are relevant to the day-to-day operation of the activities as they are relevant to the IT systems and applications. The purpose of this domain is to ensure that production systems are processed to meet the financial reporting objectives, and the errors and failures need to be detected in a timely manner. The key activities in this domain include batch jobs. Batch jobs are basically those which involve combining multiple transactions and being processed at the same time. Typically, all the transactions are similar in nature or in fact the same in nature. Batch jobs are designed to execute automatically at a pre-scheduled time without user intervention. A scheduling is done for the batch jobs. Typically, batch jobs are run at the nights so that user activity is very less. A user also could initiate a batch job and schedule it for a execution at a later point of time. Examples of batch jobs could include month-end processes, discount calculations, interest calculations, which are required to be performed on a periodic basis. The other activity under IT operations is the real-time processing. Real-time processing basically refers to the online processing of transactions, wherein transactions are initiated, processed, and recorded immediately as and when they happen without any delay in the processing of the transaction. For example, when a sales invoice is raised in an ERP, the corresponding accounting entries will automatically be available in the general ledger and the sub-ledgers. There is no time delay between the transaction happening and the posting of the accounting entries. So that is what real-time processing refers to. The other activity within operations is the backup and recovery of data. So this activity involves making periodic copies of data as well as the programs or the application software so that in case of a failure, the backup can be used to recover the lost data. We will look at backup recovery in a little more detail later on. Another aspect of operations could be interfaces. Interfaces are basically relevant when there are more than one application in a company. If there is a single application, interfaces may not be that relevant for our audit. So basically interfaces are data flow between one or more systems, and the data flow could be either real time or it could be through a batch job, or it could be even a manual interface wherein data is manually copied or downloaded from one system and uploaded into another system. The next activity is disaster recovery. Disaster recovery basically refers to the ability of a company or an IT organization to recover from a disaster which has hit the business. Like we know, there could be disasters in the nature of natural calamities like floods, there could be fire, etc., which could destroy the computer systems or the information processing facilities. Data could be lost. In such a case, there should be a process or a mechanism or a plan for the company to recover from the disaster and get up and running again. Disaster recovery is a part of the larger business continuity planning of an organization, where in the event of a disaster, how does management continue operating the business? It is not possible to stop a business because of a disaster. So management has to devise a plan where all the key activities need to be analyzed, the risks need to be assessed, and a plan has to be made. While business continuity planning refers to the overall larger business processes, the disaster recovery planning relates more to the recovery of IT systems subsequent to the disaster. The other activity within this IT operations is the help desk activity. Basically, help desk is a facility which is in place to address the user requests and the user queries. Any incidents and problems that a user faces in the operation or in using the IT systems will be referred to the IT help desk. How these incidents or problems are logged, recorded, and monitored and tracked is all about IT help desk. Here we should understand as auditors that all the activities in the domain of IT operations may not be necessarily relevant to the financial statement audit. For example, IT help desk may be more of an operational activity in nature. Similarly, disaster recovery is also operational in nature. However, certain situations may arise where the company had to restore data subsequent to a disaster. In that case, as auditors, we need to be skeptical about how the disaster recovery process happened, whether all the data has been recovered completely and accurately. So, in the event of a disaster, only we need to consider the controls around disaster recovery and the process around the data recovery. In case there is no event of a disaster which happened, then as auditors, we may not be very keen to understand how the controls in disaster recovery has been implemented at a company. However, some of the activities such as batch jobs and real-time processing and interfaces could be relevant for our audit. We will see in detail each of these activities. Now we will look at the various features and functions and understand batch jobs in a little more detail. So batch jobs are those jobs which combine similar transaction or transactions of a similar nature together to be processed at a predefined time. The important thing here is the timing at which the batch job is executed. That is called the scheduling. So the batch job can be scheduled at a particular point of a day or at any other period that is predefined. Now it is critical for us to understand the timing and the scheduling of these batch jobs and who is having access to change the scheduling, because if there is a timing which is critical for processing of the batch job and the timing has been either changed or stopped, then the batch job may not execute, in which case certain transactions may not be posted and that would impact the completeness and accuracy of financial data. So only in case where the batch jobs are used for processing of financial transactions or business transactions, we need to consider them as relevant for the audit. We also need to look at the aspect of how batch jobs are monitored. It is not just enough to schedule and leave the batch jobs and assume that the batch job has completed successfully. The company has to have a process in place to make sure that the batch job is completed successfully without any errors. In case there are errors which are noted in the batch job, the same should be identified in a timely manner and the corrective action need to be taken. The error handling part is an integral part of the monitoring, and every batch job that executes need to be monitored specifically. The status had to be reviewed by somebody who is responsible for looking at the batch jobs. Typically, it is the responsibility of the individual user who is scheduling the batch job. In case the batch jobs are scheduled by the IT, then it is the responsibility of IT to look at the status of the running of each batch job. So as auditors, we need to understand what is the process at the company for making sure that batch jobs are monitored and how error handling is done. Last but not the least, as I have mentioned before also, the scheduling of batch jobs, even the initiation of batch jobs and the access to modify the configuration of batch jobs need to be restricted to very limited number of users or only authorized users. In case of unauthorized access, it is likely that it could impact the processing of business transactions and impact the validity of those transactions along with the completeness and accuracy aspects. Basically, when we say restricted access, the person who are not supposed to have access or who are not supposed to change the scheduling should not be allowed to make changes to the batch jobs. So there should be a process even when there is a change to the scheduling of a batch job. That change should be recorded and reviewed separately. Now let us look at a real life example of how a batch job looks in a real life scenario. In this example, we see that there are several batch jobs which are running. So all the batch jobs which are being executed. And here, along with each job, we can see that there is a status. As you can see, if the status is a green tick, like in this case, that means the job has completed successfully. If the status shows a red arrow, that means it is an indicator of error in that job. You can also see that there is a code which is assigned, and it is possible that we can take a look at the error code and resolve the error. Here we can also see who has created the batch job. So when we look at samples of batch jobs being run in the ERP, we can make sure that the user ID captured along with the batch jobs and confirm that the user is an authorized user or not. We can also see the timing at which the job is run, and we can see the level of authorization of that specific user ID who has authorized for the run of the job. So in this way, we can get a comprehensive view of what are the batch jobs which are being run at any point of time. We may also be able to get a list of all the batch jobs run for a period using the logging feature of the specific ERP. Please note that in this example, we have used one ERP as an example. It is possible that in other ERPs, while the features and the functionality may be similar, the implementation or the layout or the structure may be very different. The screens may be different. So for each ERP, we need to understand from the client as to how the batch jobs are initiated, scheduled, and processed, and how error handling is done. We need to obtain evidence similar to the screenshot for the purpose of our audit to get assurance that batch jobs are being run successfully, and in case there are errors, the errors are being handled in a controlled manner. That would provide us with the assurance on the completeness and accuracy of financial data within the IT systems. Looking at the user ID also provides us the comfort or the assurance that the transaction have been initiated by the right people and the validity can be assured. Now let us understand about data backups, which is a critical activity within the IT operations. By data backup, what we mean is taking a copy of the existing data at a certain point of time and making sure it is stored at a alternate storage media or even an alternate location. What we need to consider by looking at the data backup is what is the content which is being backed up. There may be a data being backed up, but is it the relevant content? For example, is it the financial data which is being backed up, or is it just the files and other non-financial data which is being backed up? So the content needs to be clearly defined. Next up is the frequency of the backup. So for the content that is defined, how often is the backup being taken? Typically, a backup is taken once in a day, but if required and if it is a requirement of the business, it can be taken more than once a day, or in case the risk of data loss is very less, the frequency can be more than a day. Another aspect to consider for data backup is the storage. Having defined the content and the periodicity or the frequency of data backup, where is the data backup being stored? What is the media in which the data is backed up? Typically, it should not be the same media on which the production system is running. The backup should be taken onto a separate system or an alternate system. Preferably, the backup should be taken onto various types of media, including tapes or even other hard disks, or even to a parallel server, depending on the scale of the operation and the risk associated with data loss. So the storage is a key consideration while looking at backups. Restoration of data is another important aspect we need to understand. Having taken the backup, is the company in a position to restore the backup when it is required? In the event of data loss, or if there is a disaster, it is likely that the company relies on the data backup that was taken periodically. So the company has to test from time to time whether the data which has been backed up, they are in a position to restore it. For this purpose, testing has to be done periodically on the backup to make sure that the backup can be recovered or restored when the need arises. Last but not the least, restricted access to the backups. So people who are supposed to have access only should be provided access to take the backup. Typically, these are IT administrators or operational person belonging to the IT department who have the knowledge and the competence to take the backup. They should also be looking at whether the backup on a daily basis has been successful or not. In case the backup is not successful, a revised backup may have to be taken. Now let us look at an example of how a backup configurations can be done in an ERP. So this is an example of a real-time system where the backup has been configured. So here we can see that the database backup has been configured to a device, to a particular device, and the type of backup is a full backup. There are other types of backups like the incremental backup or only in delta backup. So the ideal way to take a backup is a full backup, and it includes the online and also the logs. Logs are basically recovery logs which are helpful in the event of a failure to recover data up to the last point in time. If this is not enabled, then only the backup as of yesterday, assuming that this is a daily backup, only those will be available for recovery. So here in this case, it is a good example where the company is taking backup, online backup, which includes the logs, and they are taking a full backup and not a incremental backup. So here we see the schedule of the backup. So when is the backup taken? You can see the recurrence. It is every 1 and week. So basically backup is taken every 1 week. And on every week, which are the days on which the backup is taken? So we can see here it is scheduled to be taken on Monday to Saturday. That is 6 days in a week. Sunday, there is no backup. It is possible that the company is not working on Sunday and there may not be any transaction. So the company has decided not to take a backup on Sunday. Now if you combine the two, what we understand from this example is this company has scheduled a full backup which includes the logs, and it is an online backup. And this happens every day of the week from Monday to Saturday, excluding Sundays. Now as auditors, what we need to look at is for the size or the operations that the company has and the risk of data loss that the company would carry, is this a reasonable configuration of backup? Should the company take more backup, or should they consider taking backup even on Sunday in case transactions happen on Sunday? So we need to understand through the system how the backup configuration is done and whether it is commensurate with the size nature of the business. Having configured the backup, it is also important that the backup configuration and the backup operation needs to be looked at on a daily basis. Here is an example of a log where the backup status is mentioned. So here we can see that for each day, the start time and the end time has been recorded. And there is a code, which is a status code. It is called a reason code. And what is the log file? If the administrator wants to take a look at what happened during this function, this file can be opened up and seen, and where there will be technical details. Anyway, for the purpose of our example, you can see that a full backup, online backup is happening to a tape. In the previous example, we saw that backup was to a device. That device here in this case is a tape device. Now we can see that every day the backup is successful, which is indicated by the return code or reason code 000, 4 zeros. But if you see on 2 particular days, there is an error which is also marked in red. Here in this case we can see that a backup was taken to a disk instead of a tape. We can understand a little more by asking why this is happening. Is it possible that on a particular day the backup happens to a disk instead of a tape? It is a policy of backup that the company has defined, or is it an exception? We need to understand that. In this case, there are error codes or return codes which are 5 and 3, which means that the backup was not successful. So what we need to look at as auditors is, has management or the IT operations team looked at this, and what action have they taken? Is there adequate documentation for the reasons of failure? It is possible that the tape got damaged or disk got corrupted, or it is possible that there was a power failure. So there could be many reasons why this has happened, and the reasons need to be investigated by the management, and there should be sufficient documentation that has to be provided, which we can go through and understand whether the process is working in a controlled manner. When we say process, it is the process of backup being taken. However, for our comfort, what we can do is, we can see subsequent to the dates. So we have seen that on 2 dates the failure happened. Subsequent to these 2 dates, when was the next successful backup taken. So if that is the case, then it gives us assurance that there is no loss of data that can happen, because the subsequent backup would also include the backup of the days on which the error happened. So this is the way we need to understand the controls or the process, and identify what can go wrong within the backup and see which controls mitigate those risks. Now let us understand a little more about interfaces. Basically, interfaces are data flows between two IT systems or two IT applications. It could be two or more than two. And in case there is only a single ERP or a single application, it is likely that there are no interfaces in that company. So, assuming there are more than one application and there is a data flow between those applications, we can expect to see certain data being pushed into one application from another application. If you remember the example that we have seen about SAP and Paymaster having an interface, basically the data from Paymaster, which is the payroll data, is being pushed into SAP so that accounting entries for the payroll can happen. So that is a simple example of an interface. So there are different types of interfaces. One is the automated interface. In this type of interface, there is no manual intervention. Assuming the two systems are able to talk to each other seamlessly without human intervention. That is the example of an automated interface. Another example could be a manual interface. In this case, data is manually downloaded from one system and uploaded into another system. So we need to understand the data flows between the various systems and applications. And similar to the case of bad jobs, wherever data flows are happening, it could happen through either a bad job, or it could be through a manual, or it could be through some kind of a automated routine or scripts which are executed at a certain point in time. So whenever the interfaces operate, how is it managed that the errors or the failures in the interface are identified and detected in a timely manner? Again, similar to the other activities we have seen, restricted access is a common theme across any of the operational activities. The people who are having access to automated or the manual interfaces should be only the authorized people. The IT team typically should ensure that error handling is monitored on a periodic basis. Let us look at disaster recovery and understand a little more about it. Basically, disaster recovery is a part of the larger business continuity of the organization. So basically, every company or organization should have a plan in the event a disaster strikes. There could be different types of disasters. There could be natural calamities like floods, water, and fire. There could be man-made disasters such as strikes or a financial meltdown or any other, or a systems outage, or even a cyber attack could be example of a disaster. Now in the event a disaster happens, how should the company continue or go on with the business? That is something to be considered by management as a part of the larger IT governance framework. Every company should have a business continuity plan in place. This plan usually has the various risks that can occur because of which disaster can happen, and what is the impact when such an event happens, and what are the precautions or measures that the company will take to continue or move on with business. For example, if it is a bank, the bank cannot say because today there is a disaster, we cannot provide services. So it is not possible like that. So the bank has to have an alternate mechanism of providing services. Similarly, in the case of manufacturing company, the production cannot be stopped for a long duration. So what are the alternate ways in which production or dispatches need to be made? So these are some small examples of why a company should have a business continuity plan in place. Now coming to disaster recovery. Disaster recovery is an integral part of the business continuity planning, because part of the business or a large part of the business, especially when ERP is implemented, involves the use of IT systems and applications. Now, in case a disaster involves the stoppage of IT and ERP application, how would the company recover from such a disaster, and how IT systems will be put back into place for a normal operation to resume? That recovery from a disaster and to get back to normalcy is the process of planning a disaster recovery. It is also called a disaster recovery plan. So it is a action which will be taken subsequent to the business continuity plan. Now let us look at help desk. The typical help desk operations involve problem management. What is problem management? Users who are using the IT systems and includes the ERP and applications may have certain doubts, queries, or issues that they need to highlight. So there is a team within the IT organization which takes all the queries and questions and the problems which are faced by a user and resolves those problems. One example could be a printer is not working. Another example is the network is not working or the system is slow. These are day-to-day examples of problems which the users face. So there should be a control process where the company records all the issues and problems and puts them into a kind of a tracker for them to later look at and monitor the status. Incident management is any event or an adverse event which happens with respect to system. One small example could be a loss of files in one system or virus attack in a particular system, not throughout the company, in which case it could be a bigger incident. So small incidents or large incidents, all the incidents need to be recorded and addressed in a timely manner. When problems and incidents are highlighted, they have to be prioritized. Not all problems or incidents will be high priority. The help desk needs to prioritize, or the management in the IT needs to prioritize which incidents are more important and which are less important. And there should be a process of tracking all the incidents and problems which are recorded by the users. Now, as you can see, this is more of an operational activity by nature, and as auditors of financial statement, we need to be careful not to get too much into the operations of help desk. However, we need to understand at a high level how the company is managing all the errors and issues. For example, a user could have issue in processing a business transaction, in which case it could have an impact on the posting of transactions, and there it could be relevant for a financial audit. If there is a transaction which is not being able to post it because of a system problem, that needs to be identified by management, tracked, and closed in a timely manner. Otherwise, what could happen? The transaction may not even come into the system, and that could impact the account balances. So help desks are typically managed through service level agreements, while in many companies these are formally defined agreements between the IT organization and the rest of the business. In smaller companies, it could be more informal in nature. So basically, we need to understand what kind of service level agreements, that is the turnaround time in which the IT is able to react, respond, and resolve the issues, the problems, and the incidents which are flagged by the users. The overall objective of the help desk is to make sure that systems are up and running and available for business to operate business transactions. And that is why, even though they don't have a direct implication on the processing of transactions and the financial statements, we need to understand the overall process at large. Now let us look at some of the risks and controls that are relevant to the IT operations. So here we have given a list of risks and controls which mitigate those risks for IT operations. Let us look at each activity wise what can go wrong. So here we have seen there is a batch scheduling and processing, which is an activity within the IT operation. What can go wrong within the batch scheduling and processing? We have discussed that in batch scheduling and processing, the risk could be unauthorized changes made to batch jobs. That is, users who are not authorized are able to make changes to batch jobs. The other risk is failure in execution of a batch job. So this is when a batch job is supposed to be run and it is run with, or it has failed, in which case the transaction within the batch job have not executed. So for these two risks, we can see there are two controls which are put into place by management. What are they? To address the risk of unauthorized changes which are made to batch jobs, the control is that any addition, change and deletion to batch jobs are documented and authorized. So here we see there is a process of authorizing any type of a change to a batch job, and we need to understand, evaluate and validate the control which is mentioned here. For the risk of failures occurring in a batch job, the control that can be implemented or that is implemented in this example is that all batch jobs are monitored for successful completion. Any errors or incomplete jobs are identified and rectified in a timely manner. So here we see that the company has a process of monitoring for the successful completion of batch jobs. And in case there are any errors or failures in the job, the same are rectified in a timely manner. So with these two controls, we can be assured that the risks that are mentioned here will be adequately covered. In real-time processing, for example, one risk could be unauthorized changes are made to the configuration of real-time processing components. Now, what are real-time processing components? These could include your middlewares, or it could involve your network equipment also, and it could involve any other equipment which is used in the processing of this transaction. It could be a hard disk or a server. So similarly, there could be any software or hardware change which may happen, and that could impact the operation or the processing of transaction in real time. Now, unauthorized changes to such configuration in real-time components will be mitigated by implementing a control whereby a procedure for making changes to the configuration of real-time processing components is put into place. So there is a process for managing the changes. This is likely similar to the change management process, and where we have seen the IT infrastructure components need to be changed, or the process for making changes to IT infrastructure need to be in a controlled manner. With respect to backup and recovery, some of the risks could be loss of critical data due to data corruption and system failures. So this is a key risk. And what is the control which exists? The management has put a backup policy into place, and it has been implemented and monitored for compliance. We need to look at how it is monitored for compliance, who is monitoring it, and what are the results. Loss of data due to fire and theft, which are environmental and physical controls. So for mitigating that risk of loss of data due to fire and theft, the control is on-site and off-site backups are maintained in a secure manner. On-site is the same site in which the servers or the IT infrastructure is residing, typically a data center. Offsite backup is a remote location in which a copy of the backup is stored. In case something happens to the main site, then the backup which is residing at the offsite can be used for restoration of the data which has been lost. So this has to be maintained securely. What is the meaning of securely here? It means that there should be a fireproof safe or a lock and key or both that should be put into place to store the backups. Lock and key would prevent the data from being stolen, and a fireproof safe will protect the backup from any environmental hazards, including fire. Another risk with respect to backups is backup is incomplete or corruption of media happens during the backup. So the company may have taken a backup or taking backup on a daily basis and keeping the backup at a remote site. However, in case the media gets corrupted for whatever reason, how is it possible to recover the data? It may not be possible. So for this, there is a control which says that backup recovery is periodically tested. So there is a periodic testing of the backups which have been taken to make sure or ensure that the backups are working when required. So the backups will be in a position to be used and they will be able to recover the lost data in case there is a loss of data. So that is the control which exists to protect against the risk of incomplete or corruption of backup media. Backup media here could be a tape, disk, or even a DVD or a CD. Let us look at the other activity of interfaces. So in this example, the risk that is given is data transfer between systems is incomplete or inaccurate. So we know that interfaces is the data flow between two or more systems. So when data flows from one system to another, how is the completeness and accuracy ensured? It is possible that there may be data flow which is incomplete or even inaccurate. So what is the control for that? So here the control is incorrect. The actual control should be something like this. To mitigate the risk of data transfer between systems, that it is incomplete or inaccurate, the control could be that there is a process to reconcile the data between systems to ensure consistency of data, consistency of data transfer. So this is an example of a control which helps in preventing the risk that data transfer between systems is incomplete or inaccurate. Somebody is doing a reconciliation of the data which is between the two systems to make sure that the data is consistent. For example, somebody could take the data from the payroll system, which is Paymaster, and also the accounting data with respect to the payroll processing from the SAP system and compare the two and make sure that the numbers add up. So that way, the company can ensure that the data transfer has been consistent and complete. Now let us look at the last activity, which is disaster recovery. What could go wrong? The data recovery or the disaster recovery plan may be obsolete. That is a risk. So the control for that is plans for business continuity is kept up to date, and similarly disaster recovery plans are updated once in a year and tested maybe twice in a year. This is specific to one company and also the generally accepted practice. However, depending on the nature and size of the company, the criticality of the IT systems, this frequency could be different. So as we see, this is a relevant control for ensuring the risk that data recovery plan is obsolete. Basically, the business continuity plan is kept up to date, and data recovery plan, being a part of the business continuity plan, is updated once in a year and tested 2 times in a year. So this is an example of how to look at the risks and controls within the IT operations. Like I have said before, in the other domains, these are examples of some risks which are possible. There could be other risks depending on the company and the type of ERP and the nature of their business. We need to look at all these factors specific to the company and in relevance to the audit of our financial statements. So having understood the various domains of ITGC and the various activities which fall under these domains, now let us look at when we should start testing the general IT controls. Testing of controls in IT will follow our understanding of the IT environment. While it is simple and straightforward for us to time the understanding of IT environment, which is required as a part of our planning process in the audit, and it is a requirement of SA 315, where we need to obtain an understanding of the business environment, including the IT environment. The testing of ITGCs or GITCs depends on several factors. We will discuss all these factors in detail. First and foremost, we need to understand the effectiveness of entity level controls. Entity level controls are the high level controls which the company has implemented, which include your control environment, the risk assessment, monitoring of controls, and information and communication. So these are the components of internal control framework that a company needs to put into place. And we as auditors need to perform an evaluation of the entity level controls. In entity level controls, there are certain controls which are specific to general information technology controls that we need to understand and evaluate. We have seen and understood about the IT governance level controls in the earlier slides. Let us take two scenarios. In case the entity level controls are not found to be effective, that is, assume that the company has not implemented the required policies and procedures across the company to manage and govern the IT systems. In this case, it is likely that we may not be required or we should not be relying on the GITCs because the entity level controls are not adequate. However, if you take another scenario where a company has implemented effective entity level controls and the policies, procedures are all applied and monitored and assessed on a regular basis and they have been found to be effective, in that case, we can go ahead and look at the reliance on ITGCs. In that case, we may want to test the ITGCs for the entire year. Another factor to consider our timing of testing for ITGCs is understanding of the business process and controls. As we are aware, our understanding of the businesses of the client and the internal controls that are built in will provide us insight to the level of automation that is involved in the ERP or the level of automation that a company has put into place. If the level of automation is high, then the chances are we may have to rely more on GITCs or ITGCs. In which case, our testing of ITGCs should start earlier in the audit rather than later. Also, another relevant factor would be the dependence on IT. To what extent the company, the business, the transactions, and the auditors are dependent on the IT for carrying out the audit. That would give us an indicator of when to test ITGCs. If the dependency is high, it is likely we may want to test the ITGCs earlier in the audit rather than later. The reason being, if you test the GITCs later in the day and you found deficiencies, then it could have an impact on the audit very late in the day. That is the reason, if the level of automation and the dependence on IT is high, the tendency is to test ITGCs earlier in the audit. Another factor to consider is the risk assessment. What is the company's risk assessment on general information technology controls? What is our risk assessment as auditors on the general information technology controls? The risk assessment basically rates each of the control as high, medium, and low. Typically, this is the rating that we follow when assessing the risks. If we believe that there are several controls in IT which are high risk, or if we believe there are several controls which are automated or IT dependent which fall into the high level of risk, then it is likely that we may want to test our ITGCs earlier in the audit rather than later. However, on the contrary, if we believe that the risk assessment performed for the business or the process or the controls tends to be on low risk, if the IT is not that critical for our audit and there are only controls which are medium to low risk, then it is likely we may want to test general IT controls towards the later part of the audit. Another factor to consider is how many processes or what activities of IT have been outsourced. Today, a lot of companies, especially the large companies, have a tendency to outsource routine IT activities to external firms or external service providers. In this case, where the IT or the IT activities have been outsourced, we need to probably start planning our testing of IT earlier, because there is a dependency on an external service provider and we have to factor to test our controls in the external service provider. For this purpose, we may even want to call for a report of the effectiveness of controls at the outsourced service provider. All this would require a lot of planning and follow-up. So we should plan our test of ITGCs earlier in the day when there are several activities which are outsourced. Another factor to consider, which is an important factor, is what deficiencies were observed in the past year's audit. Is there a history of deficiencies in ITGCs in the company? In case there are deficiencies, it is likely that we would want to test ITGCs again early in the year. If we have tested a company for several years and the deficiencies are low and the company has good and effective IT, then our audit may be scheduled for a little later in the audit process. When new systems are implemented or new upgrades happen to IT or the applications, we may want to get involved earlier and test the GITCs so that there is adequate coverage for the legacy system and also the new system. The level of effort involved will be higher when compared to testing one single system. So as we have seen, it is not a straightforward answer of when to test ITGCs. The factors that we just discussed are a few that we should consider in determining the timing of our test of ITGCs. In a typical ERP environment, however, it is more likely that testing for GITCs is performed earlier in the audit rather than later in the audit because of several dependencies. Also, we should remember that in deciding the timing of GITCs, the auditor should also factor the possibility of having found new deficiencies during the current year. And there should be sufficient time for the management to remediate those deficiencies and be ready for retest during the same year. This would fall under the category of remediation testing for the auditors. On the other hand, if we tend to test GITCs late in the day or towards the year end, then it is likely that there may not be sufficient time to remediate deficiencies and retest the remediated controls. We will look at in more detail what is the impact of deficiencies which are coming in GITCs later in this session. Now let us take a look at the sample size requirements when testing GITCs. The methodology and approach for testing GITCs in an audit of financial statements is the same as the approach for testing any other internal controls like manual controls and automated controls. Accordingly, the sample size requirements when testing general information technology controls are also the same. Some of the considerations that we need to take into account when auditing or testing GITCs and the sample size that we need to pick up are as follows. So we need to understand what is the population. What is the size of the population? For example, how many program changes have happened during the year? If our audit period is April to March, then it is likely that there could be hundreds of changes in the programs. Depending on the size of the population, we need to accordingly determine the sample size requirement. So population is a key consideration for determining the sample size. What is the type of control? The type of control, that is, if the control is automated, manual, or IT dependent, would determine the size of sample. Typically, for an automated control, a test of 1 would be sufficient. However, for a manual control, the sample size is again dependent on the population. For example, if the process of user modification is automated, if the process of user creation is automatic, or if the backups are being taken through an automated backup schedule procedure, then it is considered as an automated control, in which case we would just restrict ourselves to check the configuration at a point in time. However, if a control is a manual control, even within ITGC, say for example, the changes go through an approval process and changes go through a UAT sign-off, approval, and the implementation sign-off, in which case we may have to treat the control as a manual control, and accordingly we select a sample size which is equal to the size that we would pick up for a manual control. The other factor when determining the sample size when testing GITC is the frequency of the control. So how often does the control operate? Is it daily? Is it monthly? Is it weekly? So we need to make a determination of the frequency of the control while determining the sample size. The size of sample is directly proportional to the frequency of the control. Another factor to consider is the nature and timing of test. So what is the type of test that we are going to perform? So we have 4 types of test when testing any type of control. That is inquiry, examination or inspection, observation, and reperformance. If we are doing a control test by examination, we may want to pick up slightly higher sample size. If we are doing a test of control through reperformance, we may go for a lesser sample size, because reperformance gives us more assurance as compared to inquiry or examination. Hence, the nature of test of controls determines the size of sample that we can take. Another factor is the history of errors. If there is a history of errors in that company and there are deficiencies in the IT controls, it is likely that we would go for a higher sample size. In case, on the contrary, if we have seen that the deficiencies are very less and there are no deficiencies and IT controls are effective, in that case, we may take a judgment that we would take a lesser sample size for the current ERP. What is the effectiveness of entity level controls? The effectiveness of entity level controls also has a bearing on the sample size. If the ELCs are found to be effective, we may want to test less sample size. However, if the entity level controls are not found to be effective or there are gaps in the effectiveness of entity level controls, it is possible that we may pick up a higher size of samples. Again, just to reiterate, all these considerations are not specific to IT. These are considerations for testing any control in the audit. Last but not the least, the most important criteria to consider is the risk assessed. Like, what is the risk assessed for the specific control? Like we have discussed, risk assessed could be a high risk, medium risk, or low risk, depending on the level of assurance or depending on the type of control that has been implemented. If it is a control which is a high risk control, it is likely that we may pick up more number of samples. Whereas if it is a low risk control, we may want to pick lesser samples. So just to summarize, our picking up of sample sizes for testing general information technology controls is very similar to what we would do for any other control testing. Here, as auditors, we should apply our professional judgment in determining the sample size for testing controls. And the most important thing is for us to document, which is a requirement of SA 230. We need to document the reason or the rationale or the justification for picking up a particular sample size for our audit. We also need to document the source from which we have obtained the population, and last but not the least, the completeness of the source population. So, for example, if we say we have obtained a list of 400 changes from the ERP for the year, how do we know that it is only 400? What have we done to ensure that it is 400? So we need to document our justification and the process that we have followed and the method that we have applied to ensure that the source is a reliable source and the population that we have obtained is a complete population. For this purpose, it is suggested that the population is extracted in the presence of the auditor from the ERP system with the help of IT team. And the source of the population should be from the ERP system itself, preferably. Alternately, we can also obtain a list from any other ticketing tool or ticketing system. Now let us take a look at the impact of deficiencies in GITCs on our audit. So just like any other control, GITCs, when we test, it is likely that we encounter deficiencies. So what is the impact? As we know that GITCs are supporting the operation of automated controls and automated application controls. And in case there are deficiencies in GITCs, there could be a direct impact on the level of reliance we can place on the automated controls within the ERP. Also, if there is a deficiency in the operation or the effectiveness of GITCs, it is likely to impact our reliance on the sensitive access and segregation of duties which are implemented in the ERP. We may not be able to rely totally on the sensitive access and segregation of duties. The dependent controls on IT or the IT dependent controls cannot be relied if there are deficiencies in GITCs. Also, IPEs, that is information produced by entity, which is the key reports or the data which is extracted from the IT systems and the ERP system, cannot be relied if the ITGCs are not effective. It is possible because of all the above factors, like not being able to rely on automated controls, not being able to rely on the sensitive access and segregation of duties, and IT dependent controls, and also the reports, which are used both in controls as well as substantive audit procedures. It is likely that our audit approach could undergo a change. It is possible that we would have planned the audit to rely on the controls. However, after noting deficiencies in ITGCs, it is possible that we may have to change our audit approach and do more substantive audit. In case of significant deficiencies or serious deficiencies, we may have to also report the findings or the deficiencies to at least management, and depending on the nature of the deficiency, we may also have to report it to the people who are charged with the governance within the company. That is, those charged with governance. Typically, it is the board or the audit committee or any other system which is equivalent. We may also have to mention the deficiencies in our audit report, and also it could have an impact on the opinion that we give, especially the opinion on internal financial controls. So as we can see that GITCs form the central component for our reliance on the overall IT systems and environment, including the automated control, segregation of duties, reports, and other controls. And the impact could be pervasive, because if you remember the first thing we discussed, that GITCs are pervasive in nature, and if there is a deficiency in GITC, it is very likely to have a pervasive impact on all our audit procedures and control testing specifically. So with this, we come to the conclusion of this session on general information technology controls. I hope this session has given you more insight and knowledge into how to audit in an ERP environment better. Just to recap what we have learned in this session, we have understood what general information technology controls are. We have seen the definition of GITCs. We have understood various categories of controls which as relate to GITCs. We have also understood the impact of GITCs on a financial statement audit. We saw how to scope the GITCs or the ERP systems when we are performing our audit of GITCs. We have also understood the sample size requirements when doing a testing of general information technology controls. We understood the various categories or domains of GITCs, such as the IT governance, the program changes, the access security, the data center and network operations, the acquisition of new systems and implementation of new systems. We have also seen how deficiencies in GITCs impact our audit, and we have seen when to test GITCs in the overall audit. So thank you